What happens after you submit a request for DACA? After submitting a complete DACA request to USCIS will, number one, cash your check or money order and issue you a receipt notice. Again, as we stated earlier, your personal receipt number is what you will use to track your case online. And if for whatever reason you don't receive a receipt notice in the mail, the minute your check is cashed, contact your bank, try and look on the back of the canceled check for your receipt number, and you can use that receipt number on the back of the canceled check to track your case. And or if you submitted Form 1145, which is for online notification, you'll get an email that says, hey, we received your DACA application, it's being processed, here's your receipt number, a receipt number is coming to you in the mail. The next thing that will happen is you will get a fingerprint notice, which is also called a biometric notice. You'll get a biometric notice to show up at your local application support center. Your local application support center is located in your jurisdiction, and it varies depending on where you live. Some may be located close to where you live if you're lucky enough. Sometimes you'll have to jump in a car and make a trip to get there. However, it's your burden to show up at the designated appointment time and get your fingerprints taken. That is part of the application process. So even if you've submitted a complete DACA request to USCIS, if you do not show up for your application, if you do not show up for your fingerprint appointment, your application could be thrown out the window. So it's important that you get your fingerprints taken, because that is how USCIS affirms your criminal history. Next, if your support documents are incomplete or if there's a suspicion of fraud, you may either get a notice to provide additional evidence or you may be called in for an interview. This is important because USCIS has already informed us that this will be a request that will be processed by the service centers, and only cases that are flagged for being either incomplete or suspicion of fraud will be sent to the local USCIS district or field office. So this is also another cautionary for individuals who are tempted to submit doctored document evidence to establish their eligibility. If USCIS has any sniff that what you've submitted is fake, you may very well be called in for an interview, and who knows what will happen after that. But the point is, this is going to be an application process. If your application is intact, you may never see a USCIS officer. But again, if your application is incomplete, and this could be very well for individuals that we discussed earlier that may not have access to the documents that they need to establish their case. That type of individual may very well be the type of individual that's forwarded to the local field office for an interview. And or if there are other flags such as fraudulent information and or fake documents submitted. Also be advised, if you entered into the U.S. with a visa, that means that there was an application process that you went through before you even entered into the U.S. So by the time you get to this process where you're submitting a DACA request, the immigration officer that's reviewing your DACA request will also have access to all the documents submitted to whatever U.S. consulate that you applied to get a U.S. visa for. And if the information is inconsistent, that's going to be a flag for fraud. So if there's a temptation to put fake information, say for instance, you weren't 15 when you entered into the U.S., and you figure, well, I was a youth, I was never fingerprinted, they'll never know that I was such and such an age when I entered the U.S. If you actually had an application process that led you through the U.S. consulate, and here you are putting one thing on your DACA form, but they've already got in black and white what you or your parents submitted when you entered through the U.S. consulate, that's a fraud flag, and not only could you be called in for an interview, and or if they determine that there is fraud in your case, then you would very well be referred to immigration court for removal proceedings. So again, an interview is only a part of this process if you've got a problematic file where they need to question you in person about the documents that you may or may not have, or if there is suspicion of fraud. Now, upon review of all the forms, the support evidence, and if you pass the fingerprint check, once USCIS determines that you're eligible, you will be granted deferred action and a work permit that's good for 2 years. Now, if you're denied deferred action under this process, USCIS will refer your case to ICE. And if your case involves a criminal offense, fraud, or a threat to national security or public safety, this means that even if you are crime-free now and or otherwise eligible, if you submitted false documents or if you've got a past that involves crime, you will be referred to immigration court. So again, as we've stressed throughout this process, throughout this presentation, it's very prudent, and the burden is on you to really take the time to sort out, am I eligible for this or not? Lastly, if you are denied for reasons other than listed above, let's say, for instance, you improperly filed the form, or you missed your fingerprint appointment notice, it is unlikely that your case will be referred to immigration court, and you will very likely be eligible to just simply reapply. That also means that you'd have to actually submit all those documents over again and pay the fee all over again. But if there's no issues with fraud, national or public safety, or criminal offenses in your past, you won't then automatically be shuttled to the removal line. You will have the opportunity to simply just refile. But there is no appeal process. That's important to understand. In the DACA request process, there is no formal appeal process.